Hello, everyone. I have my special guest today, Jeff Doherty, and we're going to just spend some time in kind of a program I'm calling Let's Talk. And I asked Jeff to come on, kind of be the first guest, Jeff, on this show. And Jeff, I would like to introduce you to my audience and thought if you would, why don't you go ahead and just give us a little background on yourself?
Absolutely. And first of all, it's an honor to be with you. It's always a pleasure to share time with you. I appreciate all of your study and your work. I think it's very helpful. And my my background is nothing if not interesting. I spent 20 years as a licensed minister, the majority of that with the Assemblies of God, Church of God in Christ, and the Church of God, Cleveland, Tennessee as well, but mostly in the assemblies. And I'm a Bible college graduate. And for the bulk of that 20 years, I was an evangelist. I did pastor some churches, but, evangelists have to be good at a couple things. They have to be able to preach a pretty good sermon.
Yep.
They got to be able to get people baptized in the Holy Spirit, speaking in tongues, and they got to be able to cast out demons and heal too. So those are kind of the things that I majored on and things that I did. And, going church to church for as long as I did, I began to see what I call cracks in the foundation of what I've come to describe as big-time religion, and come to find out that the more I knew, the more I realized that the teachings of the Christ and this megalithic thing that we have now called Christianity or big-time religion are very, very different entities. So now my mission, if you will, is to not tell people what to believe, but to tell people, to give people as much information as possible so they can identify exactly what's going on regarding the teachings of the Christ and the teachings of modern big-time religion, and give them all the information, all the cards on the table, if you will, so that they can decide what direction they want to go as far as entrusting their spiritual growth, development, and faith in. And that's my story, Wayne. I'm sticking to it.
Well, I'll tell you what, and it's a good one. As you were talking, I was drawn back to some of my memories in the ministry, and it's so true that when I can remember men like R.W. Schambach.
Oh yeah,
and
I worked with him a lot.
Yeah, well, I was the pastor's aide, so my job in our church was to take care of all the special guests.
Mm-hmm.
And R.W. was remarkable. The man had more energy than I think a nuclear bomb.
He did. Brother Schambach was a special guy.
Yeah, I really would have liked to have known what I know now and talked to him. I knew Hilton Sutton very well. And actually, that's where I broke my teeth on in Bible prophecy. And Hilton, it's interesting what our parents and grandparents, that generation, how they saw the church, Christianity, and the story. And it was a story that, although there were schisms within the faith, there was still yet this unity bond that said, well, we still have Jesus. If there's nothing else that we can agree on, we can agree upon Jesus. And that was kind of what the mantra was that I grew up as a youth and then in my younger years. So hearing those stories just bring back a lot of that.
Now, Wayne, did I understand you to say that you feel like there might have been some possibilities that Schambach might have been open to some deeper truths?
Yes. Yeah.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah. One of the things that always tripped me up was the story of Abraham when the three witnesses came up.
Oh, yeah.
R.W. and I, when we went out to dinner after, the crusade meetings.
And he always did.
Yes, he did. You know that.
Always got his pies off the pie table.
Yep. Yes,
and went out to dinner.
Yep. So we got into discussion one night about that. And because back then I could never understand Well, how could an angel manifest themselves and look like a man, but how did they know that it was an angel? And how did Sarah, who's laughing at this conversation, she apparently had more insight than Abraham did.
She
And
wasn't buying it.
no, she was not. And I remember R.W. saying, well, he says, Wayne, that's one of the greatest mysteries about the Bible. He says, I can't tell you for sure if that was in fact an angel, an archangel, but he says, I know it was a messenger of God. And that's how, they thought back then.
Yeah.
Don't dig any deeper than that because, listen, the storyline works.
Yeah.
It does.
Interesting.
So speaking of that, I think it's a great segue to what I'd like to get into our discussion here in this hour, Jeff, is that I'd like to talk about origins. And specifically, I think here's a question I'll put out there for you. Is Christianity a pagan religion or not?
Well, of course, if you ask anyone that's in a church, you'll get an emphatic no. However, if you step back and look, and, another piece of my background is I have an associate's degree in anthropology. And of course, that gives me just enough information, knowledge to know that I don't know anything. But it does give you some idea of having a scholarly type of viewpoint. And
Yes.
if you look at the Old Testament and look at the other source documents of the other great religions, if you will, you cannot escape the conclusion that the Old Testament we'll try to be nice, borrowed heavily from many of the other great creation epics, and that there's no doubt, absolutely no scholarly textual doubt, that the original writers of the Old Testament were writing from a thoroughly polytheistic viewpoint, and the big problems within Christianity come and stem almost entirely from the effort to cram polytheistic theology into monotheistic religion.
Very interesting point, because that is a point of contention, as you know, particularly with modern day scholars in theology on Christianity. Is, again, every religion that I have found, when you start talking about monotheism, and as what we have up here, ladies and gentlemen, is actually we're going to be getting into the Chaldean account of Genesis, which you may have gotten probably a view of this with Zechariah Stitchin when he actually got a hold of these tablets. And of course, we know where he went with this, but we're going to be talking about George Smith. But getting back to the point, I can't find a religion, Jeff, myself, that is totally monotheism. I can't.
I mean, the only contenders would be Zoroastrianism or Judaism. Sure. And as we just talked about, those are both based, both have their stories based on polytheistic thought. And they're just really, I don't know what the word would be, but they did great violence to them to get them into the monotheistic form they're in today.
Yeah. In fact, anyone who really wants to get into a good textbook, I'll hold this up. This is the Tribal Wars, the Yahweh Wars. And it's a great textbook on really breaking down the Semites, which it's very interesting when I studied this. We have the Semitics, then we have the Hebrews, and then we have the Israelites. And we have this continued evolution of a culture that today we know is Judaism. And their history goes back. So anyway, it's a good book on here.
Who's the author, Wayne?
On this one here is a gentleman by the name of Randolph Smend, S-M-E-N-D.
Thank you.
Yes, and it's translated by Max Gray Rogers. It's a great book. You can get it on Amazon. If you really want to know the true history, and speaking of true history, Jeff, I've asked you on here because I have been studying the Chaldean account of the book of Genesis written by George Smith. And by the way, a little background for everyone. George Smith was the original archaeologist who actually found the original tablets in Nineveh, which is now outside modern-day Mosul in Iraq. And it was George Smith's expedition. And by the way, I did not know this, the telegraph the paper today in England financed his second trip, where they actually were able to get a lot of these tablets in the cuneiform that led into the discovery that apparently the Genesis story is not the original story. And in fact, Jeff, it gets even more interesting when we begin to find out that we find, as George said in his writings here, the Christian story of what we get in the book of Genesis, he said, is very thin on detail.
That's putting it mildly.
Yes. And I want to know, in your upbringing, did you ever hear of the Chaldeans? Did you ever have any idea that there were documents, records being found that obviously began to bring into controversy the story that is now, of course, the foundation for our religion?
You know, I similar to your background, when you're in the church and you're in the ministry, you really tend to have a bit of a myopic focus. It's like you have blinders on. You just got things that are right in front of you. It's the same way in Bible college as well. Bible college is really in no way, shape, or form a liberal arts education, and it's really in no way, shape, or form a time of enlightenment. It's a time of indoctrination, and that's one of the things that first began to bother me, because I saw I went into Bible college thinking, here's these great men that have learned for themselves, discovered for themselves, and I'm going to get to take advantage of this. And what I found out is these guys are teaching from the same tired notes they taught from 30 years ago, and they're teaching what they were learned from some other man, that some man learned from some other man, and you're really getting third, fourth generation, hand-me-down leftovers, and you don't really get into much of the understanding of beliefs and cultures outside of the Bible. I mean, you know a little bit about Babylon because, the Jews were there, right. But you don't, if you're going to do any study on that, it has to be independent. And at least in my opinion, independent study is frowned upon.
I agree.
Stay in the Bible, do what you're told, believe what you believe. And there's a great saying they used to say, when you start studying on your own, that's how cults get started.
Darn, it happens every time. And one of the things that I think for myself, and this happened, I guess about a decade or two ago, that when I began, the epiphany hit me that the Bible is not an historical document. It's a literary interpretation of historical events.
That's a great statement.
That's called typology, ladies and gentlemen. That's what you have been. I did a video series on breaking the God spell. And that literally is what's happened. And if you'll study typology, it's again, the Hebrews were smart, as were the Romans. They knew things, they understood things, particularly about, I think, two areas, politics and religion. And getting back to our point here, I wanted to put up, so this letter of introduction, you can see, was written on October 26, 1875. Now, what I found interesting, Jeff, in this was that as they got these tablets and they began to understand that something was going on, the first clue that they had was this deluge. And sure enough, as more tablets were found, and by the way, just to give everyone kind of an historical perspective, these tablets date back to about 2300 BC. There's good evidence by the scribes who wrote these records. By the way, they always gave their name and their family name as well. So we know who these scribes were that actually did this. Why did they use tablets? Well, in the region that they were in, the clay was plentiful. And they had standard size for two things. They had this large size that went into the Royal Library, and those were the collections that much of this was taken from. And the sophistication of the Chaldeans, going all the way into the Babylonians and that whole region, I was quite surprised as to how sophisticated they were. They actually have records of court cases. So that's a sophisticated society.
Absolutely. They were, as you said, very sophisticated and were, brilliant chroniclers of their lives.
Yes. And isn't that odd? So that gave me right there a clue to their sense of that they understood their place in history.
Very interesting. And you made a statement earlier that, these groups, and particularly the Romans and the Jews, understand two things, politics and religion. And they understand that those two things really make the world go round and control the minds and hearts of people. And I find it very interesting, Wayne, that what are the two things that we're never told to talk about? Politics and religion. Because the last thing you want is people discussing this openly and realizing, maybe there's a connection and maybe they're hiding something from us.
Duh. So you're absolutely right. So they are hiding something from us. That's just it. I can remember the first time I had this serious doubt was Job 1:9. And I tell you, for years, I would go around in the circles, and in the prayer groups, and I would ask people, how could Satan be with the sons of God in the presence of the Lord? Now, either the Lord isn't God, or, wait a minute, what's he doing up there to begin with? So,
yep. And of course, the King James is a terrible translation on that portion. So you were already handicapped at trying to understand it from that point of view.
Well, Sir Francis Bacon did a good job on that. You have to admit.
He did create a literary masterpiece at the expense of, accuracy.
He did. And again, it's one of those things that people don't realize, that now I know why I had such a problem with Shakespeare and reading the King James, particularly in the Old Testament. I mean, have you ever read Leviticus in the King James?
The most skipped book of the Bible.
I was like, I would rather eat glass,
Wayne, was Bacon Shakespeare?
I think he was.
I do too.
I think all the evidence is.
I do too.
I think, in fact, he was the emperor that did wear the clothes. Just my take. I mean, King James.
That's great.
Yeah. So getting back to the deluge, on what the tablet showed here, by the way, was that there are two stories that we know that's recorded. There is the one story of, and we'll get into this a little bit more, of the Is Dubar series, where there was a man who Cronus came to him in a dream, told him that there was a shift coming. Now, I found it very interesting in reading some of the words that they were finding. Shift number one. Okay, is it possible that the deluge was because of a pole shift? Just saying.
Very interesting.
Also, to all people who have heard about Nibiru, Planet X, there is an interesting word that I found in the text called Nibir, Nibir. Are you ready for this?
I am.
It translates wandering planet or star.
Wow.
And as the story goes, these are the rebellious spirits. Now, I found that very compelling. Two things that we see. Number one, clear evidence to me that what we so often think about this judgment thing of what we have grown up to be of Noah's flood really was that not at all. What it was, most likely, for all intents and purposes, a pole shift. Now, the Chaldean record also states that people lived through this.
Right.
There were high mountaintops where they did, in fact, survive. But there was an ark. There really was one. And in fact, it landed in Armenia, as the record said. In fact, in the record, it said for decades, people would go up to there and get the bitumen from the ark and use it for their own purposes, recycling it. So I thought this was very interesting. And I also wanted to get to the portion where we talk about, now this is actually the tablets itself. So you can see the challenge that they had here, Jeff, in actually these terracotta tablets. And this is actually the story of the deluge right here. So this right now brings a problem for the Genesis narrative, because again, we can see how they manipulated the genealogy to fit the timeline. Because if the timeline doesn't fit the genealogy, then you don't have a story. So I don't know if you've ever saw that before, but that's what they looked for. So I want to get in here too on the creation story itself. It's very interesting, Jeff, because we appear to have, and I want to get here. In fact, let me go back. I think we might have here. So we actually have a number of interesting characters that show up here. The big guy is Anu. Now, have you ever heard of him before in your studies?
I have. That's, he's kind of the, if you're talking about the Anunnaki and all that stuff, he's like the big god.
He is the big god. So I want to get in here specifically to talk about, here we go. So we start talking about the god Anu and Elu. And what I have found, Jeff, in tracing this, and it's just my take on it, they get into a lot of the history about the city of Ur and how Ur was very important because it was the seat of the moon goddess. Now, it's very interesting, our patriarch, Abraham, that when you begin to study his true lineage, quite a different story. And that's one of the things that began to get me going, okay, so what's going on here? I mean, if Abraham is the patriarch of both the Hebrews, the Muslims, and the Christians, then he becomes basically your cornerstone of which you build your faith on.
The cornerstone of all the Abrahamic religions.
Basically correct. And it's clear to me that as I had continued to study this, that what we have begun to see was that the story, as they have always been, were told typically word of mouth. And linguistics will tell you that the problem when you start dealing with stories that are not written down, because once they're written down, we now have what they call a hard record of it. And unless it's purposely destroyed, we now have something we can refer to, as opposed to the legends that are told around the fire tale.
Now, no one would go into a library, say in Alexandria, and intentionally burn stuff, would they, Wayne?
Oh, no, that would never happen, would it?
Certainly not by Christian people.
And, I think the other thing, too, Jeff, that I always pondered upon, my wife and I was just talking about this the other day. I was telling her, as I grew up, I said, if you'd asked me, the world evolved around the nation of Israel. That history was defined by the events of this tiny little nation and small group of people. And the reality of it is, actually, they were a very small part, an insignificant part, may I add.
A footnote.
A footnote. Which leads me, by the way, my friend, and I'm going to be jumping back over here. Have you ever heard of the ball theory of Christianity?
I have.
Well,
not to be confused with, not to throw a wrench into our flat Earth friends.
No, I'm not even going there.
The ball theory.
Listen, I have made it this far, and I've realized a few things. Number one, I still love the book of Proverbs. And one of my favorite ones is that if you're going along the road and you see an argument going on, don't stop and get in the argument. Just move on.
Just keep going.
I'm
with you, Wayne. That's my plan too.
So what what we're tying in here is this, Jeff, is that when we talk about origins, and as our technology has advanced, we're able to dig down. I mean, listen, we've got technology now that where we can take burnt papyrus, ashes, and they can now lift the words off those ashes. I mean, come on.
That's amazing.
It is amazing.
Even
And
burnt up hard drives and things they can retrieve data from.
can you imagine that?
That's something.
Yeah, there's a lesson there. So the story.
Acid washing Hillary Clinton. We're not going to talk about that either.
Oh, we could really get in trouble on this one. So for anyone who's
the woman was thorough. Give her that.
Oh, I'll tell you. And when I look at there's brilliance and then there's intelligence, you know.
Right.
And intelligence is something that can be measured. Brilliance, I think, is just like trying to define consciousness. We can see it. You know what it looks like, but don't know how to define it.
It's the old story of the politicians trying to define pornography. Well, we can't really define it, but we know what it is when we see it. Exactly.
Yeah. What was that? You know? Well, it's that fear factor. In fact, it's really interesting. I had this conversation recently. I had a pastor friend who was just shocked that I have now taken this awakened position, looking at the historical facts, challenging my faith, and it was my faith. I mean, listen, you know, I asked Jesus into my heart, by the way, which is not scriptural. There's nowhere in the Bible where it says you should ever ask anything into your heart. But that was at 12 years old. And, you know, all my life, you know, as you look at this and you try to commit yourself to the faith, but, you know, the problem was, Jeff, as I was continuing reading the Bible, let me just, little segue here. I'm reading in church. This was 2011, right? And I don't know what the pastor was preaching on. And I'm reading Mark, the 2nd chapter. And my wife is sitting right next to me. And I literally slammed my Bible down, which startled everyone. But here was the deal. I'm reading about these demons, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where the hell they come from? I mean, the concept of demon in the word, you look it up into the Greek, right? The interjection of the concept of the book of Mark, only in the Gospel of Mark, by the way, we have this new life form that, number one, are invisible, obviously can possess humans. I mean, that's a hell of a trick right there.
It is.
2, are superior in strength and been around longer than we're ever going to live. Oh, I'm thinking to myself right there in church, I'm going, this is messed up. We leave that day and the journey goes, and I'm going down this road because I want to find out seriously, where are the demons, you know? And then that leads me over to Genesis, the 6th chapter. And then I started looking at that with a whole bunch of new eyes, and I'm going, whoa. So that's kind of a little bit of my story.
Excellent.
Well, getting back to here, so Yahweh, good guy, bad guy?
Are you asking me?
Yes, sir.
Bad guy.
I agree. I agree.
The ultimate bad guy of the Bible.
Yes. And again, we are told that this is the name of the living God.
You know, Wayne, even 3 years ago, I would have said good guy.
So where did you come along and finally get the epiphany?
Well, you know, it's one of those things that it's like, you know, when you're searching for your keys, you've looked everywhere, and there they are right on top of the table. They've been there the whole time. For some reason you didn't see it. I mean, all you have to do is look at, I mean, the real epiphany came to me. The first thing that came to my mind was the Exodus. How many people did he slaughter? And then I started looking, how many times did he say, kill all the babies, all the men, all the women, rip the babies out of the mother's wombs, kill all the animals? I realized this guy is nothing but a murderer. And I believe that's who the Christ was talking about when he said, you're of your father, the devil. He was a murderer from the beginning. In fact, the original murderers. That started me down the rabbit hole that led me now to know without a doubt that Yahweh is the arch fiend of Scripture.
I agree with you. That presents a real problem, though, with us today.
Slightly.
I mean, I'm sure you've heard and probably have seen more than your share of remarks on that.
Not a day goes by, Wayne.
I can imagine. Now, you said from Cleveland, Tennessee, right?
Well, I was mainly in the Assemblies of God most of my time, but I decided the Assemblies of God were too liberal, so I went into the Church of God, Cleveland, Tennessee, which was frying pan to fire.
Boy, I'd love to hear your testimony. Seriously. All right, so getting back to our whole point, folks, listen, we're not here bashing Christianity. We're not here bashing the whole concept of religion. Religion plays a part of many people's lives. I personally have come to the point in my life, I want nothing of it. When that Catholic priest asked me, he says, well, Wayne, is God a Christian? And I looked at him, and he had this big smile on his face, and he says, when you get the answer, you've started your path. Well, I realized that, again, I did the video, does God have an ego? Well, the Yahweh God that I have seen scares the crap out of me.
Absolutely.
I go back and I can still hear things that, he enjoys the smell of burnt flesh. And then when we get into and I think about the Israelites on this. So here they're serving this deity, and I wondered, well, why did they wander off to Murdoch? I mean, not Murloc.
Marduk or Moloch.
Marduk. And then I began to think about it. Well, to put a live baby on a bronze statue, wait a minute, who introduced you to this concept to begin with? That's the question we never asked. What we did is that we summarily judged them for seeking false gods. But that's a radical departure from where you're serving supposedly this benevolent God who is there to love us, although I never saw that.
And Wayne, how do we miss the fact that by his own admission, Yahweh is vengeful, wrathful, jealous, and prone to fits of fiery anger? He tells us it over and over and over, and somehow through the maze of the mind meld that we were in, we never saw it.
Listen, I always tried to figure out, and I'll tell you what scared me many times was the verse that Paul wrote when he says it's a terrible thing to be in the presence of the Lord.
Of the living God, absolutely.
I'm going, well then, what am I being saved for?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I was thinking about us on this conversation, and I wrote down this, and I said, if being saved does not change your personality, meaning your behavior, your curiosity, your desires, then how will heaven?
Good point.
And if heaven doesn't change your personality, then that isn't going to be heaven anymore. It's like the bumper sticker I saw in Las Vegas back in the 80s when I was at a convention. You go by the gift stores, and they have these racks of bumper stickers out there. And it said that Jesus loves you because everyone else thinks you're an asshole. And it's dawned on me, well, that's really what happens. I mean, listen, we as a species love to come together for events, concerts, religious events, etc., etc. But after about 3 days, I'm tired of seeing your face. I'm out of here. And I think that that's what we have within us. So back to the point here. Sorry for the digression there. 2 points that I want to bring out to our audience is 2 things. You have to understand that there were many other cultures that played a much bigger role than what we were taught. One of them were the Phoenicians. In fact, if it was not for I call the Phoenicians really the Johnny Appleseed of religion.
Absolutely.
Because wherever they went, they deposited religious documents, that's what they traded in, amongst other things.
And they were prolific naval folks and traders.
Yes, in fact, he writes in here, they're almost called the forgotten people of the ancient world. And what I never understood, Jeff, was the connection of how much the Phoenicians, between the Hellenists all the way into the migration into the Roman Empire, that how the Romans were brilliant strategists and how they adapted this Hellenistic view of really, I think, what the Phoenicians really started or propagated.
Absolutely, I would agree with you. And that was one of the great strengths of Rome. They didn't feel the need to go in and completely decimate and destroy everything. They realized, hey, let's keep some of this stuff and just adapt it for our use, which makes it even more interesting why they did what they did to the temple. But that's a story for another day.
No, actually, I think it's a good story. What did they do with the temple? I think this is a story that needs to be told.
Well, I mean, they absolutely, and this was very atypical for the Romans. They would try to preserve the great architecture. They would try to preserve, the great stuff that of the places that they were conquering, not because they were humanitarian, but because they wanted to use it for themselves. And for some reason, in complete defiance of their normal Roman military strategy, not only did they destroy the temple, but they pulled it apart brick by brick and then plowed the place where it stood. They completely, totally, utterly decimated it. Daniel called it an abomination of desolation, and it surely was. And I mean, why they did that is, I think, a tremendously important story that hasn't been talked about enough.
Here's my take on it. Okay, so by the way, how you were talking, look at what we actually talked about here. What we now know is the efforts of these empires was the number one, to leak political and military history to the time of the development of religion itself. Now,
Absolutely.
my take on why Rome did what they did, and that was actually Titus.
Interestingly enough, the linchpin and the whole thing of destroying the temple was provided to him by one of his generals who was Jewish, whose dad had given the money and some say the designs of the temple doors through which they were finally able to breach the temple.
Exactly. Traitor from within.
Unbelievable. You can't make that stuff up, Wayne. No one would believe it, and yet it's true.
It is absolutely true, and that's the problem with most people, Jeff. And I tell people this all the time today. I said, listen, I'm not anti-God. What I am is this. I'm tired of people being ignorant. We believe in a God that we don't know anything about. We believe in a history that has no place in reality other than the fact that it has historical events woven into it. And yet, those of us who come out here and just simply try to bring the facts as to what they are, we're called the heretics. We're
Absolutely
called blasphemers. And quite frankly, when you begin to understand that there is no heaven or hell, it's a made-up concept, folks. It really is. These cats knew about it. What you're seeing here, these people who lived almost 6,000 years ago, folks, and beyond, they knew about this. They knew the concept of what happens at death. Now, going into our story, Jeff, as it's happened, when you have what I call divisions, this is when groups of people move apart, what they typically carry with them are their belief systems. They'll take those belief systems as they move, and then as they begin to adapt new ones, because after 2 generations, the 3rd generation is almost forgotten. Well, do you remember your great-grandparents?
No.
How about that? How about their lives? How about their political? You see what I'm saying?
That's profound.
3 generations, the knowledge is lost. And what happens is that it becomes, now here's the one thing I want to tell all of my Christian friends. If you think that this is heresy, you got to remember, if you go back and you want to take your Genesis story, so you got Joseph, who ends up in Egypt, second in command, and you have his family that's there in Egypt for 490 years. What do you think is going to happen in 500 years of cultural shifting? You're going to have the belief systems. Now, it may be an amalgamation of the legends that you carry, because by God, I got a family name. Yep. And don't you mess with my family name, Jack. You see? And that goes with us all the way back from the beginning. Yep. So this is how the stories have gotten so messed up. And as much as they tried to cover up, particularly, I think, the first 12 chapters of Genesis, now we know that the story, where it comes from.
And Wayne, what kind of people what kind of people are we if objective empirical history can be described as heresy? Who are we and what are we involved in if history equals heresy?
Yes, yes. It would be, the only thing that I can say, Jeff, and I'll just be very candid here, we are a species with amnesia. Are you there? Jeff? Jeff? Did I lose you? Jeff? Hello?
It looks like I'm here.
Okay, there you go. We just kind of had a little bleep there.
Yeah, everything still looked good over here, but we are having some severe atmospheric conditions.
So what was your point there before we got cut off?
I can't remember. I think that I've heard that statement somewhere else. We are a species with amnesia. It's a famous quote.
Dr. Robert Speer wrote that, and the evidence is very clear. Listen,
absolutely.
When we broke the code to the human genome, that's, folks, just to let you know, breaking the genetic code of who we are. Now, we haven't broken the cell code, but we broke the genetic code. And when that information came out, it was startling, Jeff.
Absolutely.
Because, again, what Paul Smith said in his writings here was that, unfortunately, the Genesis story is very skinny on details. And part of that detail is that we don't know where all these people come from. One of the stories I will elaborate here that I found fascinating, Jeff, in the stories of the tablets was the beginning of the world. And in this, the story is this. I'm going to try to get this for you.
Now, Wayne, wasn't Abraham either from or spent a great deal of time in that little town you talked about called Ur?
Yes, in fact, his family were of the priesthood.
And what was the god of that place?
Actually, she was what they call H-E-A, excuse me.
A lunar god, correct?
She is a lunar god. In
How
fact,
interesting is that?
She is the god of fertility. This is also, when I traced her back, before time existed, according to the record written here, there was, you can't, and people can't get this concept, but I'll just put it to you. There was a place called chaos. Chaos was a water place. It was a place filled with, hell, I don't know how to put this, mutations. Half humans, half animals.
Like chimeras.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. And when Anu came onto the scene, there was a battle. And Tiamat is what is called the serpent, wisdom, but interesting enough, also Hades. Now, let me just say this. Hades, folks, is not hell. Actually, Hades is called, and was originally believed to be, are you ready for this? The origin of life. All life springs from water, folks.
Yeah.
Now, I want to bring something out to everyone.
It's interesting you mentioned that, Wayne, because I have people on that are subscribers to my channel that are actually devotees of Hades.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, it's not what people think today. It actually is.
No.
It's where life begins. Now, there is a warning for those who go there, but that's another story. By the
Absolutely.
way, do you see the creature here?
I do.
That's the Babylonian. Now, Onanes is, wow. So Onanes is half man, half fish. He is the one who came out of the sea and taught the races knowledge. Now, this is where it all started. And you can take all of your legends and your stories, but this is apparently where it began.
And this is the guy that Sitchin said was just a frog man, right? He was coming out of the sea in
Yeah.
his scuba gear. And Sitchin was the same guy that said Hashem was a rocket ship. And that's just, I mean, he did a lot of good stuff, but that's just horrible, horrible
terrible
translation.
And unfortunately, he did more harm. I mean, if he just stuck with the facts, listen, there's good foundation that Nibiru does exist. It's wandering planets, wandering stars. And today, our astrophysicists say, oh, guess what? It appears that there are these things.
Yeah.
So, we shouldn't get all wrapped around the axle about maybe a planet passing by.
But I agree with you that it wasn't a diver coming out of the water.
No. In fact, you can see it right here. It says, when the sun had set, this being, Onanes, retired again into the sea and passed the night in the deep. He was amphibious. So what we cannot comprehend is the fact that there was a time, Jeff, that we have no knowledge of.
Right.
I mean, the Minotaurs and all the rest of the Greek mythologies, this is where they come from.
All I can think of right now is the creature from the Black Lagoon.
Bingo. I think that's maybe where we've gotten it.
Yeah.
So I know we're getting almost up on our time here. Boy, it just goes by too quick.
It does.
So I think kind of just to wrap this thing up here as we do get close to the end here, Jeff, what I wanted to bring into you and just get your take, because I know this is something that I know you haven't read yet, and I'm sending this to you, by the way. I'm going to get you a copy of the Chaldean record so you can see for yourself. I
actually have dabbled in it a little bit.
Okay, so you have some good foundation. And listen, folks, any of you can get it on Amazon. It is well worth the read. If you really are like me, Jeff, I'm dedicating my life to really, because I wanted to know what the soul is. I sometimes feel that our species has been so abused because, by the way, the fall of man is also described in the Chaldean text, but it's not the way that we were told. Apparently, man was elevated to the level of the gods. He walked with the gods in the garden. The garden is where the gods lived. And man was considered to be unique in the way that he was created, because he did have the breath of the gods in him. Now, that breath is a very interesting term, which we could do a whole show on this. But according to one of the tablets here, which I think was tablet 20, that they found in the royal palace, this is where they found it, talks about that man apparently made a deal with Tiamat, or what we would now call Satan, and partook of the, ready for this, the food that was only meant for the certain gods. And when he partook of this, that's where he set up. And because of that event, by the way, according to the tablets, it caused a heavenly war. The good and the evil mounted this huge war that, by the way, good evidence of atomic weapons being used. They give very good description. And where do we find that? In the Verdi, the Hindus. And also, the other thing I did find, this term right here. You see that one right there I just highlighted?
I do.
That is the Sarai. I can Sari, whatever I don't know how you want to pronounce that. But by the way, now here's where Stitchin screwed this one up, which I wish he had just left it alone. That is a timeline of 3,600 years.
A Sari is 3,600 years?
Yes, it is. And we have the list of the gods who reigned for tens of thousands of years.
Wow.
Yeah. This is the forgotten history. And when you begin, you see, here's the story I was telling you right here of the flood, where Cronus came in and
right.
Comes right in here, and here you can actually read it. And this is how the story goes. You can see it right there for yourself. So we have this mixing, this amalgamation of religions. Now, I don't want to say, I just want to say this for the record. What I think that the Romans were doing, because there's evidence in a lot of these ancient tablets that if you want to destroy a deity, you destroy its place of power.
I'm with you. I'm right there with you, Wayne.
That's why they tore down that temple. Listen, I said this with Steve Olson on a program that we did. I said, when Solomon betrayed the Elohim, and I think he was the original Elohim, not the Yahweh, the Elohim.
Solomon?
Yes. When Solomon betrayed the Elohim, he left. And if you study the temple, and unfortunately we don't have a lot of hard records on that. Right. It's a lot of mythology and it's a lot of legend, but apparently there was a unique power source that resided at one time with the Hebrews.
Was it the Mhulu, Wayne?
Oh, you would bring that up.
Was the Ark of the Covenant and the Mhulu, were the Ark of the Covenant and the Mhulu the same thing, or things of the same?
I think they were
group of technology.
One of the same.
I agree, 100%.
Technology. And you know, isn't it amazing how we still today, and I was trained, I mean, when you said indoctrination, that's exactly what they do. I mean, you know, it's indoctrination.
Absolutely.
But we think in technology today, except when we go and read the Bible.
Exactly.
It's like, well, there was no technology back then. So, well, Jeff, I know we're about here at the end of the time. Listen, I enjoyed this. I hope you would come back and join me again. And, you know, I think that it's important that we can start talking about the alternative of where the story that we grew up on, were nurtured on, where that story actually originated from.
Absolutely.
And if it originated from somewhere else other than what we have been told, then that tells me then we need to go and find out what was going on where this original story was told.
I agree 100%.
And listen, I champion your cause. Listen, give my viewers here how they can get to your channel, website. I know that you take donations as well. What can I do to help get some notice for you?
Well, the easiest way that people can have access to all my heresy and one-stop shopping is just to go to the YouTube channel. If you go to YouTube and put in Jeff Daugherty Show or Christian Whistleblower, it'll pop right up. And we've got now just short of 700 videos. So there's a lot there. It is categorized to a great extent as far as subject matter. And there's a place that says start here. And if you do want to understand and know where I'm coming from, that's a great place to start. So, you know, my website is jeffreydaugherty.com, but probably the best place to go is the YouTube channel. And the thing that really sparks to my mind, Wayne, and I think something that you're really helping is, you know, for 2,000 years, we have really been faced with a controlled narrative. The powers that be have had the power to control access to information. And it's only really within the last 20, 30 years that this great thing called the internet has made now all the wisdom, all the knowledge, all the data available to all of us. So we have a choice we have to make. Are we going to keep our head buried in the sand, believe what we've always been taught, and just go on down our happy road? Or are we going to be people of integrity and honesty and look to see what lies behind the foundation of our faith?
And that's kind of your mission, isn't it? I mean,
It
I know
is.
it is, and I think there's more of us that are coming to this realization. And what do you see your long-term mission being now, Jeff, as you begin to get in this portion of your life?
Well, my mission still remains to be a person that provokes people to go and investigate what they believe and helps point them to not only the information but the tools of how to do it. And something that I never saw coming, Wayne, when I was a preacher, I was a pulpiteer. I wanted to preach and run. That's really what I was about. I did have to do a lot of praying with people, but I didn't do it willingly. But now I'm working with people one-on-one every day on an individual basis. And I can't tell you how tremendously rewarding it is to see people's lives change, like that right in front of you, total, complete transformation. So still probably the primary focus is getting the information out there and equipping people to at least be able to understand what they believe and why. But taking it to the next step and actually working with people on an individual basis has been tremendously rewarding and a real surprise to me.
What are you seeing with people that spend this time with you? What is the first evidence that they talk about?
Well, the big things that I'm finding there's really two main things. People seem to have these gaps in their analytical mind, the mind that runs constantly, the mind that is supposed to be a complete record of every sensory input you've ever received from the time you were able to receive sensory input. But our reactive mind jumps up in an effort to protect us and creates these gaps. And what we're doing with people is helping them get to a place where those gaps are removed for the purpose of having a blink. Not only a blink is what I call it will instantly come to you, not only based on all the data you've received during your life, but Christ said the Comforter is given to us, and the Comforter will lead us into all truth. So getting our analytical mind straight really gives us access to the database of the Almighty. And secondly, seeing people that have been debilitated by phobias, fears, terrible traumatic memories, and seeing those things go from something that causes tears to where by the time we're working, it's a little chuckle, it's all the power's gone and they can move on.
I actually had a couple write me, and it was a very touching email. And excuse me, they said the one of the things that we've learned from you, he said, you've made us free. He said, we were held in such religious bondage.
Absolutely.
He told me, he said, they were so afraid that if they didn't spend their time in Bible study and prayer each morning, they felt that God was punishing them during the day.
Absolutely.
And they said it over and over again, just thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. So, yeah. Jeff, I have one question for you. So if someone is wanting to start out on this road of really becoming aware of what the historical record is and what they have been perceived, how would you recommend they first take that first step?
I think one of the great ways is, to watch people like you and, me and Rex Bear can help point you towards some good things. But to me, the easiest, most basic step is this. And I don't work for BibleHub.com. I don't get paid by BibleHub.com. In fact, they would probably be horrified to know that I use them.
Yeah.
But if you go to BibleHub.com, you can pull up any verse you want in the whole Bible. And you can see the original language. You can see the translation to the literal English, and you can see they've been lying to me.
Listen, I told you where my world crumbled. Seriously, I've told the story, man. Fell like a baby. Is that what? His name wasn't Jesus.
Exactly.
Well, what have I been calling? Well, and I mean, and listen. I got to tell you, I was in my 50s, and when that epiphany hit, I went, well, that's right. He was Jewish.
Yeah.
Well, why I forgot that all my life, I don't know.
But don't do that unless you're ready to have your world change.
Yes, yes, yes. In fact, I'm glad you put that. In fact, we should put that almost as
A disclaimer.
folks, listen, if you take that first step, all I got, I'm just going to be very, very candid with you. Man, it's not the fall that hurts, it's the sudden stop.
At the bottom, absolutely. And here's
Because
the thing, people have always had this concept, the truth will set you free, the truth will set you free. That's not what the scriptures say. The scriptures say you will know the truth and the truth will set you free. Truth you don't know has no freedom giving power. But once you start learning truth, it's like you said, once you turn it on, it's going to come out. It's like sometimes it's like trying to take a drink from a fire hose.
that's what ends up happening too.
So get ready.
And it happens. I mean, as you were telling, we'll close out on here, was this. I always remember the famous sermon by Charles Sturgeon and how he went to a parishioner's home who lived in.
And Wayne, let me just say before I forget, by the way, the first person that ever told me the truth doesn't set you free, it's the truth you know that sets you free, R.W. Shambach.
Ari, wherever he is, cowboy, I hope he's out there enjoying the journey. Because
how amazing is that?
I really miss him. He was a delight to be around.
Raise both hands and shout hallelujah.
Exactly. Him and Ernest Ainley.
A heel, a yeah.
I remember Jesse Duplantis saying that when he had landed at New Orleans airport, he was in his private jet and he looked over and there was the 747. And it was Ernest Ainsley Ministries.
Oh, my.
So, all right, my friend. Well, listen, thank you again, Jeff. Pleasure having you. Just a real honor. Hope to have you back again. Folks, again, this is Jeff Doherty, the Whistleblower. Go over there, sign up, like on his YouTube channel, subscribe, and folks, we'll be back again here real soon. Be kind to one another. Now, the thing is,